So, on my last video, Nova Zero asked a good question about how long would that breastplate take to be fixed and what would be the difficulties involved. And I gave a quick answer in the comments, but I figured that was such a good question, I kind of wanted to do a video on it. So for example, the armor that was beat on by the guys over at Shed Adversity, I could probably get that functional like an hour, maybe two max, depending on how much you want to refurbish it and the method by which you want to do it. Now obviously refurbishing it just so that you have something in an emergency, say if you're under siege or you've just gotten through one battle and you're probably going to need it again tomorrow, you could theoretically get that serviceable. It's never going to be as good as a brand new one. I'll just get a little bit of scrap to explain something. When you deform a piece of metal, like getting it dented in, I think the term for that is plastic deformation, but considering it's mild steel, which is similar to iron, it's it can be bent back and forth. You can pop those out, but it's not so bad on mild steel because it's soft and malleable. But on harder steels, even in this, basically every time you deform that material, you're introducing stresses to the material and work hardening it. You can relieve some of the work hardening by annealing it, bringing it up past critical temperature to let it cool down, relaxes the stresses within the material. But if you start getting microfractures, it can compromise the material and make it brittle. So yeah, once you start seeing cracks, you're in danger. So for the dents and all of that, it'd be relatively easy just to pop them out with, I would use a plastic panel beating hammer. If you're thinking historically or in a fantasy session, let's be honest, I know you guys. A wooden mallet that's domed and a stump or a flat anvil, so if you're working the inside of it with a wooden mallet onto an anvil, you can punch those dents and stuff back out, no problem. It's a bit more of a concern if you're working on higher carbon steels, because they are more susceptible to becoming work hardened and cracking. Theoretically best practice would be to work it hot, but if that's an option. I've been hanging out with a local brewhurt club, and they beat their stuff cold. But yeah, once you start seeing cracks, that's when you've got some serious problems, because the material has been really compromised. But that's just for the deformations. You can reshape them. The fold being hyperextended, you could probably get away with bending the bottom lip of the breastplate out of the way, getting over, and then putting on an anvil and bending it back so it catches without removing the rivets. Removing and replacing the rivets, it's not the end of the world. It happens. It would just be easier if you didn't have to do that, especially for the guys, because I didn't send any extra rivets down with them. But all of that kind of stuff is pretty straightforward. It's where you get to the punctures and the cuts and gouges that becomes a little bit more interesting. Now, for those small holes punched by the spear, in a modern context, I'd drill them out and plug the hole with a rivet. Historically, you would have to use a punch. It's basically, yeah, it's a tool like a paper punch, but you use it on steel. Essentially, like, you punch the hole out. That's because you don't want any tearing, because any little tear in the material from it being punctured by that spear creates a weak point which can focus force and can start it can lead to a crack forming, and then once that crack starts working along the material, that's more if it gets beaten around a bit more. But just I'd rather I'd rather drill out or punch that and plug it with a rivet just to stop that from happening. Alternatively, I have seen another repair method done. Alternatively, if you had bigger holes, there are some methods I've seen on original pieces of armor. So sometimes it can be hard to tell if these repairs were during the working life of the piece or if they were done later on by a collector in the Victorian period. They're notorious for repairing antiques. And if it was it repaired to make it serviceable or as a keepsake or for display purposes? But essentially, when you get a puncture, my first go-to would be to plug it with a rivet. But if you had something a bit bigger, or an alternative method is to either patch it, solder it, or a combination of the two. So essentially, you'll take a piece of sheet metal, similar grade to what you're working with your armor, and you'll rivet it onto the back. And you'll basically hammer it down so it's flush on the surface and grind it on the surface so that basically the whole thing becomes flush. I have seen some examples where they've put the patch on the outside. Again, don't know if that's historical but to be honest, that presents gives points where something can catch on it, so it's not ideal and it looks hideous. If you put the patch on the inside, you can kind of hide where it is. But an even better version of that is where you solder a piece of material onto the back of it with copper. You technically can do both, rivet it and solder it. Now, I have been told that the soldering point or the melting point of copper is meant to be below the temperature at which you heat treat steel. I'm not 100% on that, but apparently that's the reason why they can get away with soldering together poleaxe heads and medieval maces and stuff. They solder the parts together, and so they can have a soldered axe head without destroying the heat treatment. Apparently. So that can be an issue. What you would do is you would essentially just have, just basically just solder on the plate, and the copper, you can let the copper solder go through the hole. And I have seen examples where heavily damaged bits of armor, they've got cracks in them. They've essentially just soldered the cracks and just filled that all up with copper and polished it flush. And unless you're looking for it, sometimes you might not even spot it. But it's kind of better to have that backing material because copper is a lot softer than steel. And then that brings us on to the gouges and the scratches and stuff. If it's cosmetic scratches, you know, it's so thin that it's not really an issue, like you could buff it out. But if you got it some bigger gouges, like where it was hit with a sword, I would, if you, okay, the chances of you being hit on that exact same spot are low, but if you want to fix that and you're stuck to using period levels of technology, so you can't use a modern welder, I have seen an example where it appears that gashes in the metal have been, again, just filled with copper. So salt, they filled the gash and solder it, bit of copper, and then polish it flush. So that's how you could fix that. But again, you know, if you know we're soldering bits together, we're making patches and stuff, the material's been compromised. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend it as a first option if you're doing something like Brewhurt. Although, to be honest, I am now kind of tempted to try and solder some cracked and damaged armor back together and then re-destroy it to see how the solder holds up. So maybe that can be a future project. Maybe I'll ask some people I know who have got some broken armor if they'll let me repair it so I can destroy it again. Alright everyone, hope this has been educational. If you have any other questions, please leave them down below. I'm happy to answer any armor questions you've got, and you know, if it's really good, it gives me ideas for videos. Alright, see you.